Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Sir James Wilson Vincent Savile, philanthropist, TV personality, wrestler, cyclist, Britain's most prolific sex offender. He raised an estimated £40 million for charities and he fixed many dreams, but he also caused many, many more nightmares. So, what was Jimmy Savile's background? How might some of his early life experiences have influenced his behaviours? What were the very specific circumstances that allowed him to continue his abuse in an unrestricted, unchallenged kind of manner? What specific character traits allowed him to get away with it? And finally, what's my personal psychological analysis of him as a forensic psychiatrist? I'm going to answer all these questions and many, many more. Sit back, relax, and welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. So Jimmy Savile died on the 29th of October 2011 at the age of 84. He was, as I said, an English DJ, a television and radio personality who hosted a number of BBC shows, probably most famously Top of the Pops and Jim Will Fix It. So everybody and their grandma knows that after his death, hundreds of allegations of sexual abuse soon came out. And it also transpired that there actually were allegations during his lifetime, but they were dismissed and the accusers were kind of ignored, disbelieved and hidden away. And we actually found out later that Savile took legal action against some of his accusers, which is mind-blowingly arrogant. Okay, so a brief bit about his background. Jimmy Savile was born in Leeds and he was the youngest of 7 children in a Roman Catholic family. His father was a bookmaker's clerk and an insurance agent, and his mother didn't work. Savile grew up around the Great Depression, and what I think is quite interesting is at the age of 2, he was actually at death's door with pneumonia, and he credits that he managed to get through this because his mother prayed at Leeds Cathedral and there was some sort of divine intervention. So God does definitely work in mysterious ways. Savile went to St Anne's Roman Catholic School in Leeds, and then he left at the age of 14 to work in an office. And then at the age of 18, which was during the Second World War, he was working in coal mines. And interestingly, he actually suffered from severe spinal injuries from a shot fire's explosion. And he spent a long period recuperating and recovering from this. And that involved wearing this like steel corset. And he actually had to walk for 3 years using walking sticks. After that, Savile became a scrap metal dealer. And then he started playing records in dance halls in the early 1940s. And he actually claims to be the first English DJs. So I'm kind of touched on this before, but allegations against him had been made as far back as 1958. And John Lydon, who's the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, even alluded to them in an interview with Radio 1 in 1978. But his comments were edited out. So that to me reflects the kind of cover-up that happened in the higher echelons of entertainment, which I will come back to. Okay, so that's all the facts and everything, all that spiel out of the way. Let's get to the interesting bit. Let's talk about his psychoanalysis. This is the bit that interests me the most, and hopefully for you, as Psych for Sore guys and gals, it's the bit that you will find interesting as well. So let me ask you this question. What can we learn about him, or what knowledge can we gain when we look at his other family members? Well, to me, one of the most salient issues is that Savile's nephew was actually also charged with sexual abuse. He was arrested by police over claims that he abused a 7-year-old girl more than 40 years ago. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, to me, it's quite interesting that there's multiple perpetrators within the family. And it could just be a coincidence, that's definitely possible, but when you think of how infrequently somebody is charged with sexual assaults, there was a degree of speculation here, but I wonder if there's some sort of sexuality or sexual practices going on within the family, whether that was, an older person abusing younger family members or like sexual experimentation. Again, this is speculation, but certainly in my clinical practice, having assessed many victims of sexual abuse, this is something that happens more than you would care to think about or know about. Another aspect of Savile's background was his relationship with his mother. It was really complicated and intertwined. So in some ways, she was particularly cold towards him, but at other times she built him up to be like a almost godlike figure. So it's very enmeshed. So to me, this suggests a peculiar attachment issue. And I think this is relevant because I think this added to a weird inferiority complex that he had, as well as other elements from his past, like having to walk with a walking stick for 3 years when you're an adolescent or a kid. I'm sure that added to his inferiority complex. And I think his weird, twisted relationship with his mother was reflected by the very fact that a full-grown man, Jimmy Savile, lived with his mother. The two of them lived together until she died in 1972. And that is highly unusual, especially for somebody who's like, a famous celebrity. And I think that that's relevant because it reflects his warped general attitude towards women. So Savile never had any loving relationships. He had no interests in marriage. He never really showed any warmth or affection towards any women. He had no overt desire to have a loving relationship. And I think this indicates that he viewed women as objects rather than as equals. And he was even thought of as kind of so peculiar that he was asexual to a degree. And I think that makes him really dangerous because I think that's part of his camouflage, his ability to hide in plain sight, which I will come to later. The other thing that really strikes me if I was to psychoanalyze Jimmy Savile is the variety or the range of victims that he had. So even though we know that he mostly preyed on young girls, we also know that he abused both sexes, and he had victims who were as old as 75, and there's even accusations of necrophilia. So what does that mean? In my opinion, that suggests that his deprived acts were not about fulfilling sexual desires, and not only about fulfilling sexual desires, it was more about power, control and dominance than it was about sexual gratification, because he didn't have a type of victim. He just took sort of any opportunity. And I think another way that this is reflected is the fact that on several occasions he French kissed usually women who are unprepared and not expecting it. And this didn't lead to intercourse or orgasm. So again, I think this indicates that it's not about sexual gratification. It's more about control than it is about lust. Okay, so moving on, what are the remarkable specific personality traits that made Jimmy Savile stand out, and how are these relevant to his behaviour? In my opinion, something that really strikes me is that Jimmy Savile had so many different facades and personas, from being a DJ to a philanthropist to a TV presenter, obviously an intense sexual predator. He was a former wrestler at one point. He was a cyclist. He was a marathon runner. So in my opinion, this just screams narcissism. He's just so grandiose and he's so attention-seeking, which brings me on to another personality trait, and that is Jimmy Savile's underdeveloped sense of shame or embarrassment. So Jimmy Savile would wear silly, flamboyant clothes. He would wear gold medallions. He would wear shell suits. If you're as old as me, I'm sure you remember shell suits. He had platinum dyed hair. He wore weird sunglasses. He had this enormous cigar. So why am I telling you all this? Why is this relevant? I think that Savile intentionally presented himself as odd. He caricatured his quirkiness. And he did this, I think, to made it really difficult to differentiate him, the actual real core Jimmy Savile, from his projected larger-than-life celebrity persona. And, crucially, this masked some of his sexually predatory nature. So his sort of clumsy, overt flirtation was part of this persona. And, at best you can call it clumsy flirtation, but actually what it really is, if we boil down to it, it was a crude form of grooming. But because he's so weird and so wacky, everybody around him was just kind of roll their eyes and just thought, it's Jimmy being Jimmy. The other thing that stands out was that Savile had a huge sense of entitlement. Now, most sexual offenders do, almost by definition, by the very fact that they force sex on others for their own gratification, but I think it was abnormally pronounced in Savile, so I think it was higher even than the average sex offender. And this is reflected by his extreme boldness. So he would often fondle victims in front of other people. He was almost taunting those around him, or taunting the public, by intentionally hinting at his atrocious behaviour. And he even alluded to him being a bit of a wrong-un, a bit of a sexual predator in his interview with Louis Theroux. I don't know if you've seen that, but if you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure you also would have found it distasteful, bizarre, weird, and almost like, again, like I've said before, hiding in plain sight. So he's so bold that he thinks he can get away with it. The other thing about Jimmy Savile is he's quite charming and he's quite manipulative. He managed to fool lots of people and cajole them into accepting his behaviour. And one massive reflection of this that blows my mind is the fact that he was given keys to Broadmoor. So Broadmoor is a high secure psychiatric hospital. I've worked there myself many years ago, seen several patients there. And having worked there, I know that the level of security is intense. Like there's literally airport style searches for every single member of staff for every single shift. Before I got it took me about 3 or 4 months just to get clearance to get my keys. And I was a doctor working there. The fact that he had his own keys and there's no clinical reason is just, it just completely goes against the ethos of what high security is all about. So the fact that he even managed to convince people to, even having that conversation just shows his level of manipulation and charm. And I think he had this enormous level of arrogance. So he felt that he was so powerful that he couldn't be touched. And I have to say that this was partially true. So his colleagues, his peers, people in the TV world, they all turned a blind eye over the years. And I think this would have emboldened him and would have added to his already inflated ego. So what I'm saying is he got away with tiny little crimes, tiny little sexual offences over and over again to the point that he never got caught, nobody challenged him, and he just became extremely emboldened. And I think this is a huge factor. This is something that cannot be overstated. This is one of the key ingredients that allowed Savile to do what he did. That is, the people around him, TV executives, passively permitted his behaviour. So why did they do that is the next sensible question. Well, I think he kind of snowballed into legendary status. So Jimmy Savile would regularly have lunch with people, with police, high-level police officers within the Yorkshire Constabulary. He's kind of already infiltrated the police. He infiltrated Broadmoor, as I said. He infiltrated the BBC. So I think this added to his persona of being untouchable. And because he was so well connected, it's like a vicious cycle of making people even more scared to speak up. And I think something that's a little bit hard to put your finger on or explain is that the culture has used to be different back then. So, the whole Me Too movement, it's taken humanity a long time to catch up with the basic rights of women and of victims, but at least accepted back then that people of positions of power could abuse their power without being challenged. At least that's what I think. What do you think, dear viewers, my Psych for Sore guys and gals? Do you think the culture's changed? Do you think that has anything to do with what he was? Do you think it contributed to him being able to get away with his crimes? And if so, how? And crucially, do you think things have changed now? Another aspect is that I think is unique to this case and is really important is Jimmy Savile's access to victims. So I think one of Savile's skills, probably not the right word, abilities was his ability to find vulnerable victims. And I'm not talking about the obvious stuff like, he was on a TV show that literally had children being delivered to him for Jim will fix it. That's obvious. I'm talking about even less obvious, more bold, ballsy, if you can put it that way, victims. So Broadmoor, I mentioned that before, having access to mentally disordered offenders and nobody would necessarily believe their stories. And even like when he would do charity gigs, there's stories of him, I'm trying to think of a nice way to put this, of him inappropriately touching nurses whilst being on camera. So I remember seeing in a documentary, there was a nurse that said that he put his hands where he shouldn't have, with other people in the room whilst they were taking pictures. So it's almost like because his lifestyle and his profession was going around the country doing all these media opportunities, doing all these charity events, almost every single day for him when he was doing this was like an opportunity to access new victims. Okay, so I've told you a bit about my psychoanalysis. What's my diagnosis of Jimmy Savile? Before I tell you that, I just want to introduce you to this channel. My name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in psychiatric units. I act as an expert witness in criminal trials, giving psychiatric evidence. This channel, A Psych for Sore Minds, is a smorgasbord of topics related to true crime with a little twist of psychiatry. If you're interested in psychoanalysis of real life people, I've done one of Putin fairly recently. I've done one of Anna Delvey, so I've used the psychopath test on her. And if you're interested on the topic of grooming, which is a little bit twisted, what's wrong with you? Then I've done a video about the psychological processes of grooming, including the case of Marilyn Manson, and how to spot the obvious and the less obvious signs that your child might be being groomed. And I've done a dissection of the case of the Rotherham child abuse scandal, which is, you know, just as big, just as well known, just as horrific and heartbreaking as Jimmy Savile. Okay, back to the video. So, one thing that I thought about was, is Jimmy Savile a clinical psychopath? A clinical psychopath, the term psychopathy is often misunderstood. So sometimes it is assumed to be somebody who's extremely violent, like a serial killer, but a psychopath isn't necessarily that. A psychopath is somebody who lacks empathy, commits regular offending, or doesn't care about, they do anything for their own gratification. They don't care about the rights and the needs of other people. They have no sense of guilt or shame. But they don't necessarily commit violence. I mean, in this case, this was sexual violence, but it wasn't physical violence. And I think that Jimmy Savile clearly had some traits of psychopathy, like just very, very obviously. So off the top of my head, he was glib and superficially charming. He was certainly grandiose and had a high estimation of himself. He was manipulative, he was cunning, he was a pathological liar. He had a lack of remorse, lack of guilt, lack of empathy, poor behavioural controls. He was sexually promiscuous, obviously. He was impulsive, he was irresponsible. All of those things are features of a psychopath. However, he also lacked some of the key features of psychopathy. So, for example, there was no evidence of any early behavioural problems. There was no juvenile delinquency. There's no evidence to suggest that he didn't have realistic long-term goals or plans. And he didn't really display criminal versatility. So the typical psychopath is very well versed in lots of different types of offending, whether that's, you know, fraud, theft, physical violence, whereas Jimmy Savile, obviously what he did was prolific, nobody's doubting that, but it was the same kind of offence over and over again. And then on top of that, there's some elements of psychopathy which are either unknown or not particularly relevant to Jimmy Savile's life. So to give you an example, one of the key traits of a psychopath is that they're parasitic in their lifestyle. So they leech off other people, usually financially. Jimmy Savile didn't need to do that because he was very rich. Although you could argue that he leached in another way. So he leached to gain access or to gain media opportunities from his celebrity status. So I suppose at a stretch, you could say that he had a parasitic lifestyle. Another element of psychopathy is that people don't learn from their mistakes. So this is called, when you're talking about psychopathy formally, it's called revocation of conditional release. So that means if somebody's like on bail or if somebody's on probation, being observed, it doesn't change their behaviour. They don't learn their lessons. But you can't really say that for Jimmy Savile because he was never punished. He was never caught. And when allegations did surface, they were quashed by him and the people around him. So he never had the opportunity to be tested, if that makes sense. So what's my final psychiatric diagnosis? I don't think on balance he would be a clinical psychopath. I think he's almost there. He has lots of the traits, but I don't think he would pass the threshold because of the reasons I stated. However, I do think that he probably has antisocial personality disorder. So that is many of the things I talked about before: impulsive, irresponsible, aggressive, impulsive, doesn't care about the rights or wrongs of other people. So if I had assessed him myself, so as I said, I assess mentally disordered offenders, I give evidence in criminal trials, I would have said that there is clearly no psychiatric defence for Jimmy Savile. He might have a personality disorder, but he was in control of what he was doing. So he wouldn't, for example, have any possible finding of not guilty by reason of insanity. There'd be no role for a psychiatrist, really. There's no particular rehabilitation. Well, actually, I'll take that back. I think he would almost certainly get life imprisonment. You could argue that there could be some rehabilitation in that he could be engaged or tied in with sexual offending groups. But the counter argument, and my personal opinion, is that he's far beyond reprieve. Like his actions were so pervasive over such a long period of times, with literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 victims, that he's beyond rehabilitation. Plus, there's the argument that if he's spending his life in prison anyway, why would you rehabilitate him? But I guess we'll never know those answers because he was never caught. Okay, so in conclusion, let's keep it moving because I ain't got no time for shucking and jiving. Hopefully this episode of A Psych for Sore Minds helped you understand Jimmy Savile to a degree, a little bit about his background and how this might have influenced his behaviour. I hope we've managed to think about which specific circumstances related to his celebrity, related to his lifestyle, allowed his abuse to continue, and his specific character traits, and how he managed to fool and manipulate everybody around him by acting the fool, acting the clown, but actually he was hiding in plain sight. And I've also given you my psychoanalysis and diagnosis of Jimmy Savile. Okay, so if you're a regular on this channel, then you will see, if you're one of my Psych for Sore guys or gals, you will see that I've turned my joke meter down and I've put on my serious face. I can't really make inappropriate jokes. I don't want to be slapped by Will Smith. If you're new to this channel, I urge you to go and check out my other videos. They're generally a bit more lighter in their tone. It's quite difficult to make jokes about the UK's most prolific sexual offender, but most of my episodes are a bit more jokey, a bit more silly, a bit more surreal. Until next time, buy my book. I've got a book called In Two Minds, which is like my professional memoirs of being a, forensic psychiatrist, including lots of cases that I've dealt with personally. I anonymize my cases, but I talk you through thinking like a forensic psychiatrist. And until next time, stay euthymic, and please do not forget, I love you.